In 1913, one man controlled more wealth than the entire United States federal government. Not a country, not a kingdom, one man. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and at the peak of his power, his net worth represented roughly 1.5% of the entire American economy. To put that in today's terms, that's over $400 billion. More than Elon Musk. More than Jeff Bezos. More than anyone alive on this planet right now. But here's what nobody talks about. He died in 1937, almost 90 years ago, and his family is still worth billions. For generations later, the Rockefeller name still echoes through the halls of banking, politics, real estate, and philanthropy. The wealth didn't die. It didn't dissolve. It didn't get taxed away or spent into nothing. It multiplied. So the real question isn't how John D. Rockefeller got rich. The real question is, how did he build something that was never supposed to end? This is the story of the greatest wealth machine ever constructed in American history. And once you understand how it works, you'll never look at money the same way again. Most people think wealth is about income, about how much you make, about your salary, your bonus, your side hustle. That's not what Rockefeller understood. Rockefeller understood something different, something that the ultra-wealthy have known for centuries but almost never talk about in public. He understood that the real game isn't making money. The real game is keeping it, protecting it, and then making it work while you sleep, while you travel, while you age, and yes, even after you die. We live in a country where 70% of family wealth is gone by the second generation. Gone. Not invested, not preserved. Gone by the third generation. 90% had disappeared. The grandchildren of most wealthy Americans are, statistically speaking, middle class. But not the Rockefellers. This story matters to you right now, in 2025, because the principles behind Rockefeller's enduring wealth aren't just history. They're a playbook, a system. And while Wall Street, your financial advisor, and the school system never taught you this, the strategies are not illegal, not immoral, and not exclusive to billionaires. They are, however, deliberately kept quiet. So let's pull back the curtain. Let's go back to the beginning, to a boy born in upstate New York in 1839, to a con man father, a devout mother, and a country on the edge of industrial transformation, to a story that starts in poverty and ends in something this world had never seen before. The year is 1839. America is raw and restless. There are no automobiles, no electric lights, no telephones. The economy runs on muscle, timber, and agriculture. The Industrial Revolution is just beginning to reshape the northeastern cities. But for most Americans, life is still bound to the land. Into this world comes William Avery Rockefeller, a man who called himself a doctor, sold fake cancer cures out of a wagon, and disappeared for months at a time, sometimes with another family nobody talked about. He was charming and reliable, and in his own twisted way, a teacher. He taught his son John the art of the deal. He would barter with young John, charge him interest on borrowed coins, and tell him plainly, never give away your advantage. His mother, Eliza, was the counterweight, deeply religious, disciplined. She kept meticulous household accounts. Every penny tracked. Every expenditure was justified. John D. Rockefeller was shaped by both of them, from his father's cunning, strategy, the relentless pursuit of leverage, from his mother discipline, structure, and the habit of writing everything down. When John was 16 years old, he got his first job as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio. He was fast, precise, and obsessive. He worked long hours for almost no pay. And he recorded every single cent he ever spent for the rest of his life in a small red ledger he called ledger every single cent, not because he was poor, but because he understood something instinctively that most people never grasp. You cannot build wealth from what you don't understand, and you cannot understand what you don't track. This was the first principle, but the real story, the one that changed America, was still about to begin, because in Pennsylvania, in 1859, something black and slick and world-altering had just been pulled from the ground: oil. Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. Almost overnight, a new industry was born, and it was chaos. Men flooded into western Pennsylvania. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. The oil boom was a wild west of price swings, gushers, droughts, and fraud. Oil prices collapsed from $10 a barrel to 10 cents almost overnight as supply exploded. The infrastructure to refine, transport, and sell oil barely existed. Most people saw chaos. Rockefeller saw opportunity. In 1863, at just 24 years old, he invested in his first oil refinery in Cleveland, not in the drilling that was too unpredictable, too dependent on luck. Rockefeller didn't believe in luck, he believed in control. Refining was the choke point. You could drill 1,000 wells, but every drop of oil eventually had to pass through a refinery to become the kerosene that lit America's lamps. Whoever controlled the refineries controlled the flow. This was the second principle: find the choke point, own it. By 1870, Rockefeller had founded Standard Oil of Ohio, and then he made a series of moves that were so bold, so strategic, and so ruthless that they would eventually be studied in business schools and condemned in courtrooms for the next 100 years. He went to the railroads. At the time, railroads were the arteries of American commerce. Everything moved by rail. And Rockefeller, already one of the largest shippers of oil in the country, sat down with the railroad barons and made them a proposition they couldn't refuse. I will guarantee you massive, consistent shipping volume, every week, predictable, reliable, and exchange. I want secret rebates, lower rates than my competitors. And then in the most audacious move, he negotiated something called a drawback. Not only would he get cheaper rates, but the railroads would actually pay him a portion of what his competitors paid to ship. His competitors were unknowingly subsidizing him. Within 2 years, Standard Oil was so dominant, so cost-efficient, that competitors faced a brutal choice: sell to Rockefeller or be driven out of business. He called it his plan. Rivals called it something else. Between 1872 and 1879, Standard Oil went from controlling 10% of American oil refining to controlling over 90% of the entire industry. In 7 years, this wasn't just success. This was something America had never seen: a monopoly so complete, so vertical, so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of the country that it functioned almost like a shadow government of energy. And the money was beyond imagination. But here's where the story gets interesting, because the money was only half of it. The other half was what Rockefeller did with the money, and that's the part nobody teaches you. Not everyone was celebrating. By the 1880s and 1890s, the anger at Standard Oil had become a national fury. Small oil producers in Pennsylvania watched their livelihoods destroyed. Independent refiners sold at gunpoint prices or closed their doors. Railroad owners who refused to play ball found their businesses mysteriously undermined. Competitors told stories, many of them true, of industrial espionage, intimidation, and market manipulation. America was changing. The Gilded Age had created extraordinary wealth at the top and grinding poverty at the bottom, and Standard Oil had become the symbol of everything people feared about and checked corporate power. Then came Ida Tarbell. In 1902, journalist Ida Tarbell began publishing a series of investigative articles in McClure's magazine. She had grown up in the Pennsylvania oil country. She had watched her father's business be crushed by Standard Oil's tactics, and she spent 2 years methodically, precisely, and devastatingly documenting every secret rebate, every predatory pricing scheme, every act of corporate intimidation she could find. The series ran for 2 years and was eventually published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. It was a sensation. Millions of Americans read it, and what they read made them furious. Here was proof, documented and sourced, that one man had rigged the entire oil industry, had colluded with railroads, had spied on competitors, had crushed small businesses across the country. The political pressure became impossible to ignore. In 1906, the federal government filed an antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case dragged on for years. Rockefeller, who had stepped back from day-to-day operations, played golf and said little. He seemed almost serene while the legal storm raged around his empire. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously. Standard Oil was ordered to dissolve, to break apart into 34 separate companies. America celebrated. The monopoly was dead, or so they thought, because what happened next, what the newspapers didn't fully explain to the public, was one of the most extraordinary financial events in American history. And this is where the story takes a dark turn, or depending on how you look at it, a breathtaking one. When Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, Rockefeller owned shares in the parent company, and when the parent was dissolved into 34 separate entities, he received proportional shares in each of those 34 companies. The market, freed from the distortions of monopoly pricing, began to properly value each of these companies on their own merits. Investors rushed in. Share prices soared. Within 2 years of the breakup that was supposed to end his dominance, Rockefeller's personal net worth had roughly doubled. The dissolution of Standard Oil made John D. Rockefeller the richest man in the history of the world. Think about that. The government's biggest weapon against him. The weapon it spent years forging fires and hit him with a golden bullet. Those 34 companies. You know some of them today by different names: ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP's American operations, companies that, a century later, are still among the most valuable energy corporations on Earth. Rockefeller held shares in all of them. But here's the deeper question, and this is the one that almost nobody asks. How did a man who was already incredibly wealthy not lose it all? Most wealthy families do. The history of American fortunes is littered with names that burned bright and vanished. The Vanderbilts, the Astors. Names that once defined generational wealth and today exist mostly as street names and old hotels. Why not the Rockefellers? The answer lies not in the oil business, not in the antitrust battles, not even in the breakup. The answer lies in what John D. Rockefeller quietly built on the side while the world was watching his business empire. He built a financial fortress. Let's talk about the real secret. It's not a stock, it's not a fund, it's not a cryptocurrency or a real estate trick you found on social media. It's a philosophy, a system, a series of interlocking structures that, when built correctly, make wealth nearly impossible to destroy. Rockefeller had 5 pillars, 5 principles that he lived by and that his family institutionalized after his death. The first pillar was radical frugality combined with radical generosity. This sounds like a contradiction, but it isn't. Rockefeller was famously careful with personal spending his entire life. Even at the peak of his wealth, he tracked every expense. He gave his children dimes as allowances and made them account for every penny spent. He believed that the habit of discipline, the muscle of financial self-control, had to be exercised constantly, or it would atrophy. But simultaneously, he was the most prolific philanthropist America had ever seen. He gave away over $500 million in his lifetime, roughly equivalent to tens of billions today. He funded the University of Chicago. He created the Rockefeller Foundation. He bankrolled medical research that helped eradicate hookworm and made massive strides against yellow fever. Why give so much away? Partly conviction. He genuinely believed his wealth was a stewardship, not a possession. His Baptist faith told him that God had made him rich for a reason, and that reason was to do good. But there was also a strategy embedded in the generosity. By giving to foundations and institutions he controlled, Rockefeller kept his wealth working in structures that were legally separate from his personal estate. Structures that didn't go through probate. Structures that weren't subject to the same taxes as ordinary income. This was legal. It was deliberate. And it was sophisticated beyond anything most Americans understood at the time. The second pillar was the use of life insurance as a financial instrument. This is the one that really surprises people. Most Americans think of life insurance as a death benefit. You pay premiums. You die. Your family gets money. That's it. But the ultra-wealthy and the Rockefellers specifically used a different type of life insurance product called whole life insurance. And they used it not as a death product, but as a living financial tool. Here's how it works at a basic level. Whole life insurance builds cash value over time. That cash value grows tax-deferred. You can borrow against it not from a bank, but from the insurance company, using your policy as collateral. The loan doesn't show up on a credit report. It doesn't require approval. And the money inside your policy continues to grow as if you never touched it, even while you're using it. The Rockefellers used this structure to create what's sometimes called a family banking system. Instead of going to Wall Street banks for capital, they borrowed from themselves. They paid themselves interest. And the wealth stayed inside the family ecosystem rather than bleeding out to external institutions. This concept, sometimes called the infinite banking concept today, though the strategy predates the term by generations, is one of the most quietly powerful wealth tools that exists, and it is almost never discussed in mainstream financial media. Why? Because it benefits the policyholder more than it benefits the bank. The third pillar was the family trust. When Rockefeller's wealth began to accumulate at truly staggering levels, he worked with attorneys to move assets into trust structures. Trusts that would outlast him. Trusts with rules and governance structures that determine how money could be distributed, invested, and preserved across generations. Trusts do several powerful things. They remove assets from your personal estate, reducing exposure to estate taxes, which, at various points in American history, have been as high as 77%. They create a legal firewall between your assets and potential creditors or lawsuits. They allow you to set conditions on how wealth is used, preventing heirs from simply liquidating everything and spending it. And they ensure continuity. The Rockefeller trusts didn't just hold money. They held interests in operating companies, real estate, and investment portfolios that continued to generate returns for decades. The fourth pillar was diversification across assets that don't correlate. Oil made Rockefeller his fortune, but he didn't keep his fortune in oil. As his wealth grew, he systematically moved into real estate, including the eventual development of Rockefeller Center in New York City, one of the most iconic commercial properties in the world. He invested in banking, in railroads, later. In art and philanthropy infrastructure, in bonds and equities across multiple sectors, when oil prices fell, real estate held. When markets crashed, the insurance structures provided stability. When one sector struggled, others carried the weight. This is not revolutionary advice. Every financial advisor tells you to diversify, but what most people diversify within is still the public market stocks and bonds that tend to move together during a crisis. The Rockefellers diversified into asset classes that behave completely differently from each other. Hard assets, private businesses, structured financial instruments, real estate, endowments. The fifth pillar, and perhaps the most important one, was the institutionalization of financial education within the family. John D. Rockefeller did not simply leave money to his heirs. He left a curriculum. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was raised with the same principles his father had used. He learned to track spending, to understand compounding, to see wealth not as a destination but as a responsibility. He was taught that the family name carried an obligation to grow, preserve, and use the wealth in ways that created lasting value. Junior passed those lessons to his own children, the famous Rockefeller brothers, and so the education compounded alongside the money. This is the piece that most wealthy families get wrong. They teach their children to spend, to enjoy, to trust the family accountant to handle the details, but they don't teach them to understand. And when you don't understand the machine, you can't maintain it. The Rockefellers maintained it. But let's be honest with ourselves here, because this story isn't clean, and the Rockefeller legacy is not without shadow. The wealth that funded those universities, those medical foundations, those endowments was built, in significant part, through tactics that today would be prosecuted as federal crimes: the secret railroad rebates, the predatory pricing schemes, the industrial espionage, the deliberate destruction of competitors who had done nothing wrong except refuse to sell. Ida Tarbell wasn't inventing stories. The practices she documented were real. Thousands of small business owners had their livelihoods crushed so that Standard Oil could operate more efficiently. Families who had built companies across generations lost everything. Communities that depended on independent oil operations were gutted. And when Rockefeller gave to charity, was that genuine compassion, or was it, at least in part, a calculated act of reputation management in the face of growing public fury? The answer is probably both. Human motivation is rarely pure. There's also the deeper question of systemic advantage. The financial tools Rockefeller used, the trusts, the foundations, the whole life structures, these tools are legal. They're available to anyone, in theory, but in practice, they require a certain level of initial wealth to implement effectively. They require access to sophisticated legal and financial advisors. They require the kind of long-term thinking that's very difficult when you're worried about next month's rent. The Rockefeller system wasn't designed to be a ladder that anyone could climb. It was designed to make a position that was already elevated nearly impossible to fall from. That is a legitimate concern. And it speaks to something much larger: the way American society structures wealth accumulation in ways that compound advantage for those who already have it. This isn't a conspiracy. It's architecture. And whether you find that inspiring or infuriating probably depends a great deal on where you sit in that architecture. Let's look at the actual numbers, because they are staggering. At his peak in 1913, John D. Rockefeller's wealth was estimated at approximately $900 million in today's purchasing power. That translates to somewhere between $25 and $40 billion in direct equivalents. But as a percentage of the overall American economy, it was closer to 400 to 500 billion in contemporary terms. He controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining in the United States and about 33% of all domestic oil production at his peak. Standard Oil's annual profits in the early 1900s were running at roughly $80 to $100 million per year, at a time when the entire U.S. federal government budget was around $500 million. After the 1911 breakup, as we discussed, his wealth effectively doubled as share prices of the constituent companies surged. During his lifetime, Rockefeller gave away approximately $550 million, roughly 60% of everything he ever made. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, has given away over $20 billion since its founding and remains one of the largest private foundations in the world today. Rockefeller Center, developed by his son in the 1930s during the Great Depression, a controversial decision at the time, is today valued at over $3 billion and remains one of the most recognizable commercial real estate developments in America. The family office Rockefeller & Co., later rebranded as Rockefeller Capital Management, manages tens of billions in assets today. And while the family's direct holdings are difficult to trace precisely due to the complexity of their trust structures, various estimates put the combined Rockefeller family wealth somewhere between $10 and $11 billion across several hundred living descendants. For context, that wealth has survived the Great Depression, World War II, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the 2008 financial crisis, a global pandemic, and nearly a century of estate taxation, and it is still there. That is not an accident. Now here's the part where I want to speak directly to you. Because everything I've described, the trusts, the insurance, the diversification, the family education, you might be sitting there thinking, that's great for a billionaire. What does any of this have to do with me? More than you think. The principles don't require billions to begin. They require a shift in how you think about money. Here is what I mean. Most Americans operate on what financial theorists call a linear wealth model. You work, you earn, you spend. Maybe you save some. You put it in a 401k, hope the market goes up, and plan to access it at 65. You pay taxes at every stage. And if something goes wrong, a medical crisis, a lawsuit, a business failure, that money is exposed. The Rockefeller model is a circular wealth model. Money flows in, but it's immediately routed through structures designed to protect it, grow it, and put it to work in ways that generate more inflows. The goal is not to reach a number. The goal is to build a self-sustaining system, and the entry point is smaller than you think. Whole life insurance policies, properly structured, can be started for a few $100s a month. The cash value builds slowly at first, then accelerates through the power of compounding. Family limited partnerships and certain trust structures can be established with relatively modest assets and provide meaningful protection and tax advantages. The habit of tracking every dollar. Ledger, in Rockefeller's case, costs nothing but attention and creates the clarity that makes every other decision better. Diversifying beyond the stock market into real estate, small businesses. Income-producing assets isn't reserved for the wealthy. It requires education and patience. But the tools exist, and the educational imperative is talking to your children about money. Teaching them not just to earn but to think about wealth as a long-term system that costs nothing except intention. None of this is a guaranteed path to the Rockefeller level. Let's be honest about that. But the gap between where most Americans are and where they could be, using principles that have been quietly deployed by wealthy families for generations, is enormous. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, just 48 days before his 98th birthday. He had outlived most of his critics. He had outlived the breakup of Standard Oil. He had outlived 2 of his 5 children. At the end of his life, he was a thin, bald, serene old man who handed dimes to strangers, played golf, and attended church every Sunday. He seemed almost unbothered by the scale of what he had built or the controversy it had created. In his personal writings, he returned again and again to the same themes: discipline, stewardship, the idea that wealth was not an end in itself but a tool, a powerful, dangerous, magnificent tool that could build or destroy depending on the wisdom of the hand that held it. Whether you admire him or resent him, and there are legitimate reasons for both, you cannot deny that what he built was extraordinary. Not just the original fortune, but the architecture that held that fortune together across generations when virtually every comparable dynasty crumbled. His legacy reshaped American capitalism. The antitrust laws that broke up Standard Oil became the template for all future antitrust regulation. The modern energy industry, from the gas station on your corner to the pipeline networks that run beneath your city, traces its lineage directly back to decisions Rockefeller made in Cleveland in the 1860s and 1870s. The philanthropic model he pioneered, the large-scale, strategically directed private foundation, became the blueprint that Carnegie Mellon, Ford, Gates, and Buffett would all follow. And the quiet financial infrastructure he built, the trusts, the family office, the educational tradition, has been replicated in various forms by virtually every major wealth dynasty that has successfully navigated more than 2 generations. America changed because of Rockefeller, not just economically, legally, culturally, in the way we think about corporate power, about antitrust, about the relationship between wealth and public responsibility. And a century later, the most important question isn't whether you think he was a good man. The most important question is, what are you building? Here's what I want you to sit with. The average American household has less than 1 month of savings in cash. Almost half the country couldn't cover a $1,000 emergency without borrowing. And yet the tools to build lasting wealth, the philosophies, the structures, the habits have been sitting in plain sight for over a century. Rockefeller didn't hide them, lived them publicly. He wrote about them. His descendants have discussed them in books and interviews. The information was always available. What was missing was the framework to understand it. Now you have the framework, so the question isn't whether these strategies work. History has already answered that question. The question is whether you're willing to think differently, to plan longer, to build something that isn't just about the next paycheck or the next purchase, but about a system, a legacy. Something that compounds while you sleep and stands after you're gone. Rockefeller started with nothing. Less than nothing, a con man for a father, and a frontier economy that didn't care who succeeded or failed. He built the most enduring private wealth architecture in American history. And he did it one principle at a time. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, drop a comment below. What was the detail that surprised you most? The secret railroad rebates, the insurance strategy, the fact that the breakup made him richer. Because we're just scratching the surface of the financial stories that shaped this country. There are names you know and names you don't, whose decisions echo through your wallet, your taxes, your retirement account, and your daily life right now. Next time, we're going inside another dynasty, another system, another story that the history books summarize in a paragraph, but that deserves a documentary. If you want to be there for it, you know what to do. History isn't just the past, it's the playbook.